welcome back. This week we continue our study of the categorical syllogism by picking up where we left off. What we already know is how to put an argument into standard form, which is to say, we know how to rewrite an argument so that its elements appear in the right position in the syllogism. In other words, we know that we have a major premise, a minor premise, and the conclusion. The conclusion's grammatical subject is called the minor term, and the minor term appears in the minor premise that goes second in the order of premises. The categorical syllogism's conclusion contains also a predicate, a grammatical predicate, and that is known as the syllogism's major term. That major term appears in the major premise, which is first in the order of premises in the syllogism. And then the term that appears twice, once in each premise in the argument, is known as the middle term. So we saw how to organize our argument so that it comes out in standard form, or reorganize our argument, I should say. And then we also looked at how you can test an argument using the Venn diagramming method on the modern interpretation of the universal. So just a quick distinction, we saw also that putting your argument in standard form is not required for you to be able to successfully test the syllogism using the Venn diagramming method. But working systematically is useful overall for your understanding of how you can restructure, or I shouldn't say restructure, reorganize an argument to reveal its structure. Now, what we're working on this week is a continuation of the work that we started last week, as I mentioned at the outset of this video. What we're going to do is learn how to diagram our argument using the Venn diagramming method. This time, however, on the traditional or Aristotelian interpretation of the universal. We will also look at the ways in which the application, or sorry, let me rephrase that. We'll also learn how to apply rules of the syllogism in terms of an argument that has been rewritten in standard form. So we'll see the another way in which standard form is useful to us. We need to have an argument in standard form in order to apply the rules of the syllogism. In addition, as part of this mix of learning about the rules of the syllogism, as well as understanding what it means for an argument to appear in standard form, we will learn about what's known as the mood and figure of a syllogism. So all of these elements are part of an overall system of working through the organization and testing of a categorical syllogism. So let's get started. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have already looked at how we take an argument and reorganize it to reflect standard form. And we used the modern interpretation of the universal as our standpoint for Venn diagrams that test an argument for validity. Now we're going to look at how we can use the assumption of existential import, namely the traditional or Aristotelian interpretation of the universal, to also test an argument for validity. And that will be another version of the Venn diagram. Then we'll look at the mood and figure of a syllogism, which is useful to us in a couple of ways. And one way is to help us understand a shorthand for looking at a standard form categorical syllogism, but it's also useful to us as we learn how to apply the rules of the syllogism. And the rules of the syllogism is a second method whereby we can test an argument for validity. So the first method that we're learning is the Venn diagramming method. Within the Venn diagramming method, where we learned the modern version, and today we'll look at the traditional or Aristotelian. Then we'll look at how we can use the rules of the syllogism to also test an argument for validity. So recall the difference between assuming the existence of at least one member of the class in a universal claim. And by at least one member of the class, we mean the subject class. So when we diagram the universal affirmative, we shade the area of S that's outside of P. And then when we assume the existence of at least one member of the subject class, we put an X in the SP area of overlap, and the assumptive part of that diagram is putting that X in a little circle. So take a look at the the left-hand diagram that has the area of E outside of T shaded, and then the area of C outside of E shaded. And you'll see in the area of overlap between T, E, and C a red X with a circle around it. That is our assumptive member of the subject class. When we're dealing with a universal negative, we also, remember, assume that there is one member of the subject class, but we're going to make another assumption, which we'll see in a moment, and that is also that there is a member of the predicate class. So just bear that in mind as we're going forward. Okay, so first, we know that when we have a universal premise and a particular premise, we diagram our universal first. When we don't have a particular premise, but instead have two universal premises, it doesn't matter which we diagram first. So let's go ahead and look at the argument we're given. All C are E, all E are T, therefore some T are C. Let's first look at the modern interpretation, and notice that when we diagram all C are E and we diagram all E are T, we do not assume a member of the subject class for either the major premise or the minor premise. That's why there's the note that says no X appears here in that overlap area. On the other hand, when we look at the traditional interpretation, we see the following. We see that when we diagram the first claim, all C are E, we assume there is a member of the subject class, which in this case is C. When we diagram the claim all E are T, we also assume a member of the subject class in E. Let's take a look now at an argument that is similar to the one that you just saw, but that gives us another variable here, namely the aforementioned diagramming of the universal negative, assuming that both the assuming that both the subject class and the predicate class have members. And I'll explain why in just a moment. So on the modern interpretation, here again, we've got two universals, so it doesn't matter which you diagram first. If you diagram in order, you'll see that on both the modern and traditional interpretation, the area of VC overlap is shaded. Then on the second when we diagram the second premise, all C are L, we see that the area of C outside of L is shaded. So you have matching diagrams for that part of the interpretation of the universal. But now take a look at the traditional or Aristotelian interpretation. Let's start with the minor premise, all C are L. So the area of C outside of L is shaded. And then you see that you have a circled red X in the CL area of overlap. There is a circled red X there because we assume there is at least one member of the subject class, namely C. Now take a look at the area of overlap between C and V, or V and C. That's shaded, that's the major premise. And then notice that there is a circled X in the area of V outside of C, which is a standard traditional interpretation of the universal negative. There is also an X in the area of C outside of V. And yes, that is because of the universal premise that we talked about first, but you'll also notice that the way that our author interprets the universal negative is consistent with, on the traditional interpretation, the fact that the universal negative distributes both classes. And so when we convert a universal negative, we get no PRS. P becomes the grammatical subject class, and there is at least one member there. So if you take a look at, I'm sorry I don't have it open right in front of me, but if you go into chapter 6 and you look at pages 236 to 237, you'll see a discussion of the assumptive step in the universal negative, whereby you mark both the subject and predicate areas that are available in the universal negative claim with an assumptive member. Okay, so we've got through that. Now let's talk about validity. Recall that we have in our in our modern interpretation, the following. We have no VRC, all C or L. The conclusion, some L are V, if the argument were valid, would give us an X in the area of LV overlap. But that's not the case. There is no X there. If you pull your eyes over to the traditional interpretation, you see that there is a circled red X on the line of the area of overlap with V and L. And the fact that we've got a line straddler means that that X may or may not be within the LV overlap area. Hence, the argument is invalid. So one of the things that you're going to want to do is understand that an argument that is valid on one interpretation may or may not be valid on another. In this case, the argument is invalid on both interpretations. Now let's back up one slide so that we can take a look at this argument that we started with, where we were just talking about what we're looking at. We didn't actually walk through whether or not the argument is valid. On the traditional interpretation, this argument is valid. Why? Because when we diagram the premises and we assume the existence of the member of the subject class, C and E respectively, in our major and minor premises, we have diagrammed the conclusion. There is at least one T that's a C. Now, one caveat here to bear in mind as we go forward is this. This is a provisionally valid argument. What we are going to want to know is whether or not that assumptive X is an actual X. Notice, on the other hand, on the modern interpretation, this argument is invalid. Okay, let's move on to mood and figure. Now, mood and figure are technical terms for, respectively, the type of categorical proposition that is involved in a given syllogism, and then the figure is the order in which the middle term appears. So more on figure in just a moment. Notice in both of these examples, the mood is based on the fact that the argument is in standard form. So in order to understand mood, if your argument is not already in standard form, you've got to rewrite the argument in standard form. If, however, you're given mood already, if you start out with being given the three letters, then you know the argument is in standard form. You know you're dealing with a universal major, a universal minor, and a universal conclusion, all of which are affirmative. In the second example, the mood is EEO, that is universal negative, particular negative, in respectively the major and the minor premises and the conclusion. Figure, as I mentioned before, tells us the placement of the middle term. So you know that there are four possible placements for the middle term in any syllogism. And the adopted method, you'll see this in any textbook you open, is the four figures look as you see on the screen. Figure 1 has the middle term in the grammatical subject position of the major premise and the grammatical predicate position of the minor premise. Figure 2 has the middle term in the grammatical predicate position of both the major and the minor premises. Figure 3 has the middle term in the grammatical subject position of both the major and the minor premises. And lastly, figure 4 always has the middle term in the grammatical predicate position for the major premise and the grammatical subject position for the minor premise. Notice also that the argument is always already in standard form here, right? Major term appears first, that is in the major premise, and the minor term appears second, that is in the minor premise. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion, and so your conclusion is always going to be SP, SP, SP. Notice also that figure doesn't tell you anything about quantity and quality. Mood doesn't tell you anything about the placement of the middle term. So we've pulled everything together here in this example. The mood and figure is, respectively, A, figure 1. There are 64 possible combinations of mood, and there are 256 possible permutations of the categorical syllogism. Only 15 are valid in both the modern and the traditional interpretation. You can certainly memorize these, but it's better to not only know that these are valid under both interpretations, but to know how to show or demonstrate that validity. Next, we have the rules of the syllogism. Now, in some textbooks, the rules will be presented in some textbooks, you'll be given 5 rules. In some textbooks, you'll be given 6. The only reason for the difference is that in some textbooks, 2 of the rules are collapsed into 1. And you'll see how that works in just a moment. So I'm going to focus on the rules, not the fallacies. We can work on the fallacies when we practice together. But what you do is the following. Once you have your argument in standard form, you can walk through each of the rules to make sure that your argument passes each of the rules. If your argument fails on any of the rules, then that means the argument is invalid. Now, we're going to start with the modern interpretation of the universal. And what I mean by that goes back to, let me back up just a couple slides. What I mean by that is this. If you look at the modern interpretation and you see that you don't have an X in the area that's designated, that means that the argument that you see on your left, all C or E, all E or T, some T or C, that's invalid on the modern interpretation, but it's valid on the traditional. Now, you're going to see one of the rules has a one of the rules references two universal premises and a particular conclusion. Depending on what interpretation you are using, an argument is going to be valid or invalid. All right, let's go back now to the rules. Rule number 1, the middle term must be distributed at least once. What does that mean? Well, you can go all the way back to chapter 5. You recall that distribution is a way we talk about the relationship between the subject and the predicate class in a categorical proposition. So we know, for example, that the universal affirmative distributes the subject class but not the predicate class. Well, what if in your argument your middle term appears in the subject position of a universal affirmative claim? That means that your argument satisfies or passes rule number 1. Rule number 2, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in its corresponding premise. What that means is this. If you look at your conclusion and you see a particular affirmative claim, you know that the particular affirmative claim, the I claim, distributes nothing. So you don't have to worry about whether or not there's any distribution of the subject or the predicate class in the corresponding respective premises. But if there is a term distributed, then it has to be distributed in its corresponding premise. So take, for example, the conclusion as a universal negative. The universal negative distributes both the subject and predicate classes. So that means the minor and the major term are distributed in the conclusion. In order for your syllogism to pass rule number 2 in that case, both the minor and major terms have to be distributed in their corresponding premises or premise. Rule number 3, a categorical syllogism cannot have 2 negative premises. Rule number 4, a negative premise must have a negative conclusion. And this is where typically in textbooks where you have 5 rules and not 6, rules 4 and 5 are collapsed into a single rule. So a negative premise must have a negative conclusion, and a negative conclusion must have a negative premise. And then rule number 6 refers to the slide that I went back to just a couple minutes ago, in which I mentioned that on the modern interpretation of the universal, when your syllogism has 2 universal premises and a particular conclusion, it's going to be invalid. The syllogism is going to be invalid. But that's not necessarily the case when you have when you're working on the traditional interpretation. So what you'll do is take your rules, you'll have them right next to you as you're practicing away, and you just check off each rule as you go through a syllogism to make sure that your syllogism satisfies the requirements. You'll also want to be able to test the argument for validity using the modern Venn and the traditional Venn. Okay, let's do a little bit of practice. I3. what are we asking about here? We're asking about mood and figure. So take a moment to go to page 244 and 245. You know that an I claim is a particular affirmative, an A claim is a universal affirmative, and an I claim is a particular affirmative. So that means your major premise is an I, your minor premise is an A, and your conclusion is an I. The number 3 refers to the figure. So figure 3 tells you that your middle term is in the subject position, and by that I mean the grammatical subject position. Okay, so if you haven't done so already, go ahead and turn over to page 249. And while you're doing that, I'm going to write out the standard form of this argument's mood and figure. So we have some M RP, all MRS, some SRP. Right, so remember we just were over on page 245 or 244 and 245 to look at mood and figure. Okay, now what I'd like us to do is look at the rules of the syllogism. So rule number 1 says the middle term must be distributed at least once. Well, recall that a particular affirmative does not distribute anything. The universal affirmative distributes the subject class. And notice here we're toggling between talking about the subject class in terms of the grammatical subject and predicate, and the subject class in terms of the minor and the major terms. So rule number 1, it passes because the minor term distributes the subject class of the proposition, and the subject class is the middle term. So rule number 1, the middle term must be distributed at least once. Rule number 2, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in its corresponding premise. But remember, the particular affirmative does not distribute either the subject class or the predicate class. And so we don't have to see whether or not excuse me, either is distributed in its corresponding premise. Rule number 3 says that a syllogism can't have 2 negative premises, and we've satisfied that rule because neither premise is negative. We have also satisfied rules 4 and 5, and that's because we don't have either a negative premise or a negative conclusion. And then rule number 6 does not apply, or another way we could say it is our syllogism passes rule number 6 because it does not have 2 universal premises. So let's see, did we get everything right? Yay, we did. Now let's take a moment here. I went ahead and erased our standard form, our write out of the standard form. And what I'm going to do now is go a little bit above and beyond what we need to do here. The focus, as you know, is on the rules of the syllogism. But let's take a look at... Good drawing there, Mia. I didn't leave myself much space at all. Let's take a look at our argument from the standpoints of the traditional and the modern. So we'll do modern and traditional interpretations. Okay, so the first premise says that some SRP Remember though, when we have a universal premise and a particular premise, we diagram the universal first. So the universal says all M are S. So we shade, we shade, we shade, we shade. And remember that we are going to assume there is a member of the subject class, right? Okay. On the modern interpretation, all we do is shade the M, the area of the M class that's outside the S class, and we don't do anything else. Premise 2 says some M are P. So we need to, since this area is shaded, let me make that clear, we need to put an X here. Some M are P. So now we've diagrammed both the traditional and the modern, and the conclusion, some SRP, appears in both. Now I know I put an assumptive X here on the line, but that's because at the time we weren't sure if we would have an X inside or outside of the area of M that is in S, but outside of or inside of P. So this argument is valid, and we've now been able to test it in two main ways. We've tested it by the rules of the syllogism and by the Venn diagram method. So you can see that we're building a really robust system, or we're learning how that system is built. And we will spend some time this week practicing not only with the new stuff that we've talked about just now, but we'll also keep pulling in older material so that you can continue to practice with, for example, the working out of an argument in terms of rewriting it in standard form and then testing it on the modern interpretation of the universal using the Venn diagrams, and then also using the traditional interpretation and the rules of the syllogism. So get ready for practice, and in the meantime, check out our site, because I will post basically a one-sheet rule sheet that will have the rules of the syllogism on it, as well as the distribution rules and the four figures. And that's kind of a handy sheet to have at your disposal as you're practicing and as we're working together on practice. So we are going to next move into looking at how we can take more complicated arguments, and by complicated I basically mean longer or incomplete arguments, and rework them so that they reflect standard form, and then we can test those using the methods that we've learned.